in cloud. Hi, welcome to our presentation entitled Critical Literacy Practices During Early Childhood Read-Alouds. My name is Sandra Osorio. I'm an associate professor at Illinois State University in early childhood and bilingual education, and I'm previously a bilingual classroom teacher as well.
Hi, my name is Emma, and I am a first grade dual language teacher at Dr. Williams Elementary School. And last year, when we were doing this study, I was teaching second grade dual language.
So here's an outline of what we're going to cover in our presentation. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what is critical literacy and why it's so important, especially in early childhood classrooms. Then I'm going to provide an example of work that I did when I was a classroom teacher in second grade dual language around the topic of immigration and the importance of being vulnerable. And then Emma is going to share her experience sharing her own adoption story for the first time with her second grade dual language students. So many of you have possibly seen this infographic that represents data that's compiled by the Cooperative Children's Book Center out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so what we see here is what is being published, what is accessible to students in classrooms across the United States. And so you see the greatest group represented is whites. So over 50% of the books have the main characters, being white. The second group is 27% of animals or others. And so you see students of color, that could be First Nations, Latinx, Asian Pacific Islander, Black or African American students are very low represented. Even if we add up those four numbers, we still wouldn't even reach the 27% that is animals. And so it's so important in the classroom to have representation, to have curriculum that's reflective of our students, but a lot of times it's even difficult for teachers to get access to them. And so the research question that we're trying to answer or share a little insight about today is, how do early childhood teachers implement critical literacy practices in their classroom through the use of children's literature? And we feel this is very important for especially early childhood students, which we're talking about, maybe kindergarten, 5 years old, 6, 7, 8, because a lot of times individuals think that young children are too small or too young to have conversations such as race, or have conversations about immigration and what it means to be undocumented. And we're just going to share a little bit of insight of how we've been able to do this work and open up spaces for these types of conversations with young children. And so first, I am sharing what it was like when I came into the classroom. I came into the classroom in about 2005. And at the time, I was a bilingual teacher in a developmental program. So developmental program means that all my students were native Spanish speakers. And so Spanish was either a home language or a first language. And so for my school and my district, I was required to use this basal read or Hufflin Mifflin called Lectura. And so what it had was this anthology that had about 10 stories in it, had 2 anthologies for second grade, so about 20 stories for the whole school year. And then when I started looking at it critically, I noticed there wasn't really representation of my student population, of my Atlantic student population in the book, even though it was in Spanish. Really, when I looked at it, I found out it was a direct translation of the English version of the same anthology. So that was a major issue, right? Because if my students are all Latinx, or all bicultural, bilingual, I wanted books and stories that really reflected that. And so we see here on the right, one story, it's called The Gran Bigote by Gary Soto. And so if you look at it, you might think the character maybe is Latinx, but nowhere in the story did it talk about their cultural background or linguistic practices or anything like that would really give you insight into the character and their background. And so that was a major issue. And so what I decided to do in the classroom was make a change. And while using this anthology, which was required by my school, I also started looking into using more Latinx children's literature that was out there. And so one of the stories that I used in my classroom was Super Cilantro Girl, La Super Niña del Cilantro by Juan Felipe Herrera. And so this book, a lot of the students really enjoyed it because it seemed like it was like a superhero or whatnot. This was with the second grade classroom that I brought it in. And so in this story, the little girl's mom, who you see in the pocket, is deported because immigration comes into a factory where she's working. And so the little girl throughout the story ends up becoming Super Cilantro Girl and goes and saves mom. And so here we see an example of a conversation that happened during the reading of this book and the discussion of this book. And so the first line, M, is maestra, or T for teacher. And so I say, entonces ustedes dicen que no deben haber fronteras, ¿por qué? So you're saying there shouldn't be borders, why? And so Carlos, these are all synonyms, says, porque todos, para que todos puedan estar free. So everyone can be free. So Carlos' opinion is there should be no borders. Everybody should be able to be free. So I ask, okay, so why is it important to be free? And Carlos says, para que no se tengan que esconder aquí. So you don't have to hide here. Liliana had a very different opinion. She said, yo digo que sí, no. I say that yes and no. No, porque hay muchos malos a veces. So no, because there's bad people. We want to keep bad people out. And then sí, porque la gente que necesita visitar a su familia. And then yes, we shouldn't have borders because, people have to visit their families. So Carlos and Liliana had very different experiences. Carlos was born in the United States, US citizen, to two undocumented parents. So Carlos had the experience that he could not travel to Mexico to visit extended family. So he really felt like he was secluded from his family. That's why he says, so you don't have to hide, right? Because that's what he's feeling. That's his experience. Liliana, at the other hand, during this time, parents had a green card and were actually studying to take the US citizenship exam. And so she every winter was going back and forth to Mexico to visit family. So she knew she had that experience of crossing the border and all that. So this is just an example of opening up that space for students to have that conversation. It's not about saying one opinion's right and the other opinion's wrong, right? It's really just about students having a conversation and having that space to be able to share their thoughts and ideas. And so here we see another book that I used in my second grade class, and it's Waiting for Papá, Esperando a Papá. And so the reason I chose this book is because I actually had two students who were separated from their father. One had a father who had been deported a couple years previously, and then mom had remarried here in the United States. And then another one had parents that had separated, and then she was no longer living with her father. So I felt like this might be an opportunity for them to connect with it. And so here we have a conversation about, is it okay not to follow the law, right? There are laws in place where you need to have papers in order to enter the United States, or unless you'd be considered undocumented. And so here we see Camila shares her opinion. And she said this in Spanish, but just to make it easier for everyone, I put it here in English. And so she says, I think it's okay not to follow the law because you have to do something. You have to do it, but you just can't return. Like if you go somewhere and stay there, then you can't return. You can't go back. Well, my mom and dad just crossed because maybe they wanted to see what it was like, or maybe they want to have an adventure or something. That's good for learning. But if you like kill someone and you leave, then that is not following the law. And so we see here Camila, a second grader, already has the idea of like when you leave a country, a lot of times you can't go back, right? Because you're leaving the country because there's some situation, right, that's possibly unsafe. But she really makes it clear, like she knows her parents crossed the border and were undocumented, but she's like, not really sure why they did. She's like, maybe it's just they wanted an adventure. But she's like, it's not like they killed somebody. It's not that serious in her eyes, right? Because it's a very complicated situation. Leaving a country for safety issues to come to the United States, being undocumented is a very complex situation. But here we see students, young students, right, having conversations about what it means to be undocumented. And, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And so here we see an example of vulnerability. And so when I talk about vulnerability, it's super important if I'm expecting my students to be able to share their personal stories, that I also am willing to myself as a teacher be vulnerable. Of course, as a classroom teacher, you have to make sure you're being appropriate, that what you share, is not too much information. There's always like that line, right? And so here we see an example of a connection I made when we read the story. The story talks about the little boy Jose being separated from his father, right? And so at the end of the story, the dad's able to come to the United States and reunite with his mom and him. And so I shared, por ejemplo, en mi situación, so for example, in my situation, Pepito no vive con su papá. Pepito is one of my children, my eldest. Pepito y Poncho, Pepito y Poncho are my two boys, viven conmigo, they live with me. Su papá vive en otra ciudad. Their dad lives in another city. Entonces ellos los fines de semana van a ver a su papá. So on weekends they see their dad. They don't live with them. During the week, I say, Pepito de vez en cuando se pone triste y sí extraña a su papá. Sometimes during the week he gets sad and he misses his dad. So I wanted to make that connection of, even though it might not be me, feeling sad, that my kids also are separated from their dad. And so there is kind of that sadness. And so being able to share that, open up a space for my students to share stuff like Victor. Yo tengo dos papás, uno que se fue a México y otro acá. So that was Victor, who I previously said, had a dad deported. And then I had another student say, no vivo con mi papá. And that's all she was willing to say. This was the student that had the parents that had separated. And so it's super important for me, even though I have that information, I would never put a student on a spot or try to force them to share stuff, but I'm just opening up that possibility. That's all she said about it. And we left it at that. I don't try to question her or get more information about her, about the situation, because she'll share whatever she's most comfortable sharing. And then Lucia made the connection. She was saying, she's with her parents. She doesn't miss her parents. Pero los únicos que extraño son mis abuelos, porque ellos son los que necesitan mucha ayuda. So the only ones that I really miss are my grandparents, because they're really the ones that need help. And so she has grandparents back in Mexico. Those are the ones that they go and visit. And so those are really the ones that she's missing. And so all my students could, and most teachers and most students can connect to the idea of separation. Either you're separated from a friend or you're separated from family. You might have family that lives in another part of the United States or even another country, and that feeling of longing. And so here we see another book, From North to South, Del Norte a Sur, by René Colatola Inés. And so in this story, also another story about mom being deported, but in this story a little bit different is Jose and his dad end up going to visit mom on weekends, who's staying in a home for people who have been deported. And so they talk about this show called Primer Impacto. It's a new show on the Spanish network. So First Impact is a translation. And they talk about how in this show, they're seeing that Mexicans aren't wanted here in the United States. So we see Lucia saying here, they're trying to send them to Mexico because they don't want Mexicans. They want just Americans here. And so that got me thinking, because I knew that my students were all born US born. So they were technically US citizens, quote unquote, American. And so I wanted to see how they felt being Mexican and American. And so Alejandra said, and this conversation took place in Spanish, but here is a translation. Alejandra said, I feel bad because my mom says that if they deport her, well, if they take her to Mexico, she doesn't know who to take. If to take us with her or to leave us here. And if my mom says if they stop her, it can be that she never sees us again because they will leave and they can leave their children with another family. And so Alejandra has this interesting situation where she's what we consider a mixed status family. A mixed status family means that part of the family is documented, part of the family is not. Alejandra's mom, dad, and older sister are undocumented. Alejandra herself and then her younger sister were born in the US and are US citizens. So mom has already had the conversation with this young 7-year-old child, letting her know of the possibility that there could be one day that she comes home from school and mom might not be there. Her family is very lucky that they have a strong family, extended family network that lives in the town. And so mom has told her, I don't know if I have you stay here or if I take you back with me. But that's a reality that I didn't know, before using these anthologies, the required curriculum with my school district and my school. I wasn't getting these kinds of stories because my students weren't able to make connections with them. Now that I was implementing this Latinx children's literature, I was learning a lot more information about my students and their lived experience that I hadn't learned about before. And so here we see, this is from inside the book. And it says, Jose says, when are you coming home, mom? And mom says, soon, mijo. Remember, papa is a permanent resident now. He submitted my papers already, and a lawyer is working on my case. And so I put this here just to draw attention to the importance of being critical of books, right? Being able to open up conversations of like, this might not be everyone's experience, becoming documented when you're undocumented is not always an easy process. It's a process that could take many years. It's a process that some people might not even qualify for. And so while the book, of course, might paint this picture of like, oh, this is so great, so easy. We handed in some papers, a lawyer, take care of it, no problem. That's not the reality for all. And so making sure to open up that space to have that conversation, being able to push back on the story. And so here's such an example of that, of a student sharing their personal narrative. And it was so interesting to me that my students really knew status of parents, right? Who was documented, who was undocumented, their own status. So here we see student says, mi mamá y mi papá no tienen papeles. So my parents don't have papers. And then she says, mi papá Esteban. No vayas a decir, mi papá Esteban sí tiene papeles. So mom and dad are separated, mom remarried. So stepdad does have papers, right? And so student says, sí, yo nací aquí. Yo nací aquí, yo tengo papeles. So she knows she's a US citizen. She was born here. She has rights as a US citizen. So clearly parents are having these types of conversations with students. And so I'm just opening up a space in my classroom for them to share what they want to share. It's not for me to do anything with the information, but just for them to feel comfortable sharing about their lived experiences. And so in that story, we talked a lot about deportation and what it means. And so here are just some quick examples of other students sharing. And so Lucia shared how her uncle had been detained and that her family was unsure if he'd be deported. Alejandra shared that her dad had been stopped during a trip to Chicago. He was driving and they had been stopped by the police. They had been followed by the police. And he was told by police officers that he could no longer drive because at the time that this happened, of course, anybody who's undocumented did not have a right to a license. That fortunately has changed. But that was a struggle, right? That you can't get to work, you can't get anywhere without a car and not being able to drive. And then again, an example of just me sharing a story from my dad. My dad was a dock foreman at a factory. And so he one time told me a story about having to hide one of his friends and coworkers when immigration came. And so being able to share that. And so you might think, oh, well, I don't have those kind of stories, right? How am I supposed to talk about my students about this? But it's really just about how can you as a teacher facilitate this conversation and just open up the space for them to really share their own stories and whatever they want to share.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about a family unit that I did in my second grade classroom last year. The main topic that I wanted to talk about was just all different types of family, because I knew that all of my students had different family backgrounds, different family structures, and I really wanted to open the space for the students to be able to share things about their families and to be able to talk about it. And I also wanted to share my experience with the students and really show that vulnerability and explain to them a concept of adoption, which some of them might not have had any experience with before. So here are some of the books that I use. This first one, A Family is a Family is a Family, which is kind of more of an introduction to possible different family structures. Love Makes a Family was also talking about acts of kindness and acts of service that could happen in a family. And from there, we really talked about how, family could be people that you're related to, blood related to. It also could be people who are in your life who you really care about. Your friends could be part of your family, or aunts and uncles and their kids or stepchildren or things like that are all still part of your family. The next book we talked about was Nuestra Clase es una Familia, which means our class is a family, which we also really want to talk about how, like, in our classroom, we have a classroom community and we all care about each other like a family does. The book I Don't Have Your Eyes was really talking about hitting more on diversity within a family, and how if parents or other siblings in the family are of different races, even though they don't look like each other, they are still part of the family. Con Tango Son Tres was with Tango is 3, and that was talking about 2 dads and a baby. In talking about animals and in the zoo. And then that also touches a little bit on adoption as well, because how did they get the egg? Oh, someone who didn't want the egg, or one of the penguins who had too many eggs, gave one to them. So that was kind of where we first started to hear a little bit more about adoption. Tell Me Again About the Night I Was Born shares another adoption story about a child who was adopted within the United States. So I really wanted to give different options, because not every adoption story is going to be the same. Not every adoption story takes place in the same location. There's various different structures, just like various different family structures. Tengo una mamá y punto is about, it means I have a mom and that's it. And so it's about a daughter who just has a mom and a dog and kind of their life together, which is also another type of family structure that I knew some of my children had in the classroom. So I really wanted to make sure that all of the kids felt like they were being represented in some way, and that their family structure, whether it was traditional or not, was being seen throughout this lesson. And then the last one, In Our Mother's House, is about 2 mothers raising 3 children. And as you can see in the picture as well, it's a very diverse family, which I also really appreciated, because all of our students in the classroom also have are also very diverse. All right, so at first we started just talking about what is a family. Before we got into this family structures, before we got into adoption, we just kind of wanted to talk about, okay, what do you think a family is? And so as we were reading, we made a KWL chart, what you know, what you want to know, and what you've learned. And so at first we were talking about, oh, well, what do you think a family is? And so at first the students were just saying, oh, family, it's the people that you live with. And as we kind of kept talking about it, we were learning about other family structures, step parents, aunts and uncles raising kids, grandparents raising kids. So we started to kind of learn more about the students and their families, and then also many different family structures. And this was all optional. The students didn't have to share about their personal family if they didn't want to, but many of them, once they started hearing, oh, I have a stepsister, or I have a stepfather, more students started to share about their personal stories. And then as we kept talking about families, we kept reading about books, their knowledge of family grew. And so they started to realize, oh, different is good. And what's most important about a family is that there's love involved, people who love you, who care about you, who want to keep you safe. And so at the end of the day, the ending message we kind of realized about family that we kept seeing from each book was that love is what makes a family. And you don't always have to be in the same house or be next to each other or see each other all the time. A family is forever and in your heart. So then after we were going through some of these books, I first started with just kind of introducing what is family, different family structures. Then we started hearing about adoption. And so before I shared my personal story, I wanted them to at least know what the concept was. For a lot of students, they didn't know what that meant. They've never heard of that word before. And I kind of compared it to, when you adopt a dog or when you adopt a cat, because that was something that, oh, okay, yeah, nobody carried the dog or the cat in their stomach, but you went somewhere, you signed the papers, and you got this animal that now is part of your family that you love and you take care of. So that was kind of something that they at least had heard of before. Many of them had had animals in their own house. So that's kind of our starting off point for talking about what is adoption. And then throughout a few of the stories, it did mention, oh, 2 moms had a baby, 2 dads had a baby. And some of the kids started asking, well, how is that possible? Because in some point in their life, they've seen either a woman or a mom being pregnant and having a baby, and now there's a baby in the family. But they were very confused about what does that mean? If two dads have a baby, how is that possible? And obviously I didn't want to get into any of the logistics about that. So we just kind of talked about how, you know, if two people have a baby and they don't want the baby or they can't take care of the baby, they give it to somebody who can. And so that was kind of what we talked about. That's what the definition I gave for adoption. And then we started thinking about different stories, we started seeing more adoption taking place. And so then after we had kind of heard the term a few times, seen it in literature, then I shared my personal story with the kids. And this was the first time I'd ever shared my personal story with any of my students. So I was a little bit nervous and trying, you know, kind of map out how I wanted to say it. I really wanted to make sure that they understood what was happening. And I know, you know, there would be some questions probably following, but I really wanted to make sure, you know, that, okay, I'm being vulnerable with you. I'm sharing a personal story. Like, please make sure we're being kind with our questions. We're kind with our comments. As I would with any other student who was sharing something personal, but I really wanted to set that foundation for that group time to just really be like, okay, you know what, this time we're learning about new things. If you have questions, that's fine, but we're still being respectful. We're still being kind. So I feel like that really kind of set the stage and opened up the space as well for not only me to share, but for the students to share as well. So as I was sharing my story, it's all like typed up here, like exactly what I said, but I'm going to paraphrase it for you really quick. So I was born in China, and when I was a baby, my mom like couldn't take care of me. My birth mother, we talked about specific terms, birth mother, birth father, adopted mother, adopted father, couldn't care for me. And I was all the way in China. And so they found two parents who wanted a baby, but couldn't have a baby. And I didn't really go into specifics about why or anything like that, but just kind of like they really wanted a baby, but for some reason they just couldn't have a baby. And so I really explained how my birth mother, who was in China, sent me and put me up for adoption to the United States, where my parents in the United States were able to take care of me and provide for me and things like that. And so that also kind of, we had that conversation of that's why I shared a picture with them as well of my family and what we look like. And that also opened up the conversation, oh, but that's why we don't look alike, but we're still a family. I still call my adoptive parents mom and dad. And again, not every family is the exact same. Not every adoption story is the same, but it just kind of gave the students more context to my family, a little bit of background, and then also how adoption is not necessarily a bad thing either. It could be a great opportunity for the baby, a great opportunity for the parents who are getting this new child. And then also it kind of explains for the birth parents that they're not bad people either. You know, we really don't want to paint this picture of like, oh, they're bad people, they're good people, things like that. Just, you know, sometimes that happens and this is what happened and here we go. So after sharing my story, I was really worried what kind of questions they were going to have. I'd really only shared it with like other adults or other people in the past, friends that I've had, family friends. And, you know, no one was ever super rude, thankfully, but they were kind of like wondering different questions or asking about my sister or things like that, which are all valid questions. But I was a little worried how students would react because sometimes they just don't have a filter and they will just tell you exactly how they feel and what they're thinking. But surprisingly, the students didn't have a ton of questions. One student, as you could see, said, oh, okay, cool, like the penguins, just because that was one of the stories that we talked about where they saw adoption taking place. Another student was talking about my sister because she is also adopted from China, but we're not adopted from the same areas in China. So I did talk to them about that, and they were just saying, "Oh, it's so cool! You can all stay together, and you have them, and you're all a family." So they really didn't ask a ton of questions. I was a little surprised by it, but they were really just like, "Oh, great, yeah, like this story, like this story." They had already been exposed to the concept, so me sharing my story wasn't necessarily new information, but more just making it a more realistic story for them, and then taking it from the picture book to, "Oh, this could be someone's real life." Another student said, oh, you look like your sister. And that was kind of when we talked about, okay, yeah, we might look alike, but that doesn't necessarily mean we were like born in the same family or anything like that. And then we kind of had that conversation. Oh, do you kind of look like your cousins sometimes? Yeah, you don't have the same mom, but you know, you could look similar. And then, yeah, that the last comment as well about my story, asking about my sister and where she was born in China and things like that. So they really didn't have questions specifically about adoption, more just about, oh, and what about your sister? And like the penguins in the story that we already read about. So I was really happy to see that they had already just, was accepting of the idea, was just like, oh, okay, great. So that was nice. And then talking about some struggles, as I was going through this family unit, I knew that a couple of my students were having difficult family situations, and I wanted to be sensitive about that. And this is kind of just an area of improvement for me for continuing this lesson in the future, because I don't have all the answers. But I really wanted to think about, okay, so what do you do if you have a family, an unsafe family? And I just wanted to, when we were talking about families in general with all the kids, it was a lot about, oh, they all love you and they care about you. But unfortunately, there are also some incidences when there is a family who maybe they love you, but something happens and that's an unsafe situation and that child can't be in that situation anymore. And so I really wanted to show the children that just because someone is in your family and you love them, that doesn't necessarily make all of their decisions and all of their choices okay. And so what we kind of talked about and how I tied this into my classroom last year, we really just talked about unsafe and safe feelings and actions. And it was a little bit more broader than I wanted to go, but I did also want to kind of get the point across that, if you're in an unsafe situation, make sure you have 3 adults who you can tell. They could be people in your family, they can be people in your school family, in your friend's family, but I really wanted to make sure that a few of those students who possibly are in unsafe family situations knew who they could go to, what they could talk about. But I also didn't want to draw away from the great conversation we were having about how great families are and how much love is in the family. So I didn't want to take away from that either. So it was just kind of more of like, if you need anything, if you feel unsafe, make sure you talk to somebody, more like that. And so I think moving forward, that would be an area for me to work on and grow in as I continue this lesson in the future.
And so now just some quick takeaways. And so really planning ahead. Many times, many of us as teachers really plan the books, right? Like what books are we going to share? But we don't think as much about what questions we might have. So it's always extremely important to also plan questions, where the conversation might go. It's not about controlling the conversation and making sure it goes in a particular direction, but it's just being ready, right? Some probing questions or some opportunities for students to be able to share their story. And then the second one, share your story, right? If we're expecting students to be vulnerable, it's also important for the teacher to model that, right? And be able to share about their own experiences. This is all based on really making the relationships, right? And making it a safe space, a comfortable space where students feel like that connection and they feel safe and comfortable. The danger of the single story. So really making sure that you choose books broadly, right? That various students are able to connect to. And so if you saw in my example, all the books I shared for this presentation were on immigration, but that was in no way representative of all the books that I shared in my classroom, right? Because if I share just books about immigration, then I'm equating all Latinx students are immigrants and all immigrants are undocumented, right? And that's not true. We know the majority of students in the United States that are of Latinx descent are actually US born, right? And we have already generations and generations that are here in the US. And so we have to recognize that. So it's important just to making sure you are choosing books broadly, like Emma shared, right? About different families so that you can make sure your students are all represented, right? They might not, your one of your students is not going to be represented across all the books, but at least you have one book that every student can connect to. And so relationships matter. It's really important to know your students, and that way that can influence the kind of books you choose and everything like that. So really getting to know your students and building those relationships, as I previously said, so you can have these conversations. And then the last picture is just really about welcoming students' full linguistic repertoire. Both of us are working with multilingual students. And so depending on if the book is in English or Spanish, it doesn't mean that the conversation is going to be in that language, right? The book can be in English and you can still have the conversation multilingual, right? In both, because you're just welcoming the student to share in any possible way they want. So a teacher might ask the question in Spanish and the student might respond in English, or vice versa. And it's, instead of shutting that down and being like, oh no, we're in Spanish time, you have to talk in Spanish, or we're in English time, you have to, it's really just about opening up that space for them to use their full linguistic repertoire, all their languages, to be able to share their experiences. And so the final slide we have is just to share a little bit about our different experiences. So when I did the work in the classroom, I really did this by myself. I was starting to see problems with the scripted curriculum I was required to use. And I was taking classes in graduate school, so I was being a little bit more critical. And so I decided to use this Latinx children's book, but it was really by myself, right? So there was a lot of mistakes that I was making, but I didn't have people to talk to. And so Emma's experience is very different. She's going to share a little bit about that, about a professional learning community where she is with other teachers sharing.
Yes, so for my experience, I was a part of the professional learning community, which I really appreciated. Now, all of the teachers in the community, we didn't do the exact same topics, we didn't pick the exact same books, but we were all working together to make our own units. And it was really great to be able to share our knowledge between other people, share resources, other books. If, one teacher had a really great book about families and they're like, oh, I've used this in the past, you should check it out. Things like that were really great to just kind of collaborate and work together. We were also able to problem solve together, find solutions all together. We even practiced like presenting different books and talking about different books all together, and got feedback from each other about things that went well, things that we should work on. And so it was really nice just to have that community and to bounce ideas off of each other, get feedback, and just really share with other educators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the PLC was very interesting because they all modeled vulnerability, right? Because they were willing to share video recordings of them doing read alouds and really, what's going well, what can be improved. So it's a really excellent space. So I hope from our presentation today, you're able to take away some ideas of how to use, different books to implement critical literacy in your early childhood classrooms. Thanks for watching.